Breaking news. What went wrong in Putin's long friendship with Wagner's boss Prigozhin? Their connection began in the shadowy underbelly of Russia's state security services and criminal networks. As Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner military firm became one of Russia's most powerful institutions, Vladimir Putin came to rely heavily on its successes on the battlefield in Ukraine. However, it was in the seedy early 1990s St. Petersburg scene, during the politically tense years following the Soviet Union's collapse, that their paths first crossed. The cultural and economic center of Russia and the birthplace of both men. The city is famous for being the home of the Hermitage Museum and the Imperial Winter Palace, but it is also known as the crime capital of Russia and the stronghold of organized crime groups. Prigozhin had just been released from prison, and Mr. Putin had just returned from a mission in East Germany as an officer with the Soviet Security Service, the KGB, and was looking for a way into politics. The exact circumstances of their first meeting are unknown. Prigozhin's criminal history began at a young age, and he was immediately convicted. He was given a lengthy prison term for robbery in 1981, following a suspended sentence for theft in the late 1970s. He was one of 3 people who tried to strangle a woman in the street before making off with her winter boots and earrings. Russia had changed drastically by the time he was released from prison in 1990. The Berlin Wall had come down, perestroika, restructuring, was well underway, and Mikhail Gorbachev, a reformist, had taken over as Soviet leader in place of Leonid Brezhnev. From corn dogs to foie gras, Prigozhin worked as a hot dog vendor in St. Petersburg in the early 1990s, but by the middle of the decade he had opened his own eatery. It's likely that their initial encounter took place in the old custom house. Crime bosses and Anatoly Sobchak, the powerful mayor of the city, came for the foie gras and oysters on the menu. Putin, then 40 years old, accompanied Sobchak as his deputy. One restaurant opened by Prigozhin quickly grew into a chain frequented by politicians from all over Russia, not just St. Petersburg. Prigozhin's nickname, Putin's chef, originates from the turn of the century, when Mr. Putin became president, and the 2 men became close associates. He and President George W. Bush had dinner served by Prigozhin, as evidenced by this photo. A personal chef was a necessity for the new Russian leader to ensure that his diet was healthy and well-balanced. Always a suspicious KGB mind, he later led the FSB, the agency that succeeded the KGB. Having a man whose innermost secrets he would have known and who he could influence was also very helpful. As Vladimir Putin assumed power in the Kremlin, the Russian government's security apparatus gradually regained its footing. Prigozhin undertook a wide range of assignments within the Kremlin, especially sensitive jobs that the security apparatus avoided. This created enough distance between them that the man in the Kremlin could credibly deny any knowledge or involvement. Prigozhin established a media conglomerate with the express goal of propagating propaganda within Russia and beyond. Its fictions were so outlandish that no government censorship board would ever approve of publishing them. As the power of social media grew, he established a troll factory, whose primary goal was to convince Russians that there was no such thing as the truth and that it was futile to go in search of it. He denied being the mastermind behind the Internet Research Agency for another decade. First reports of the Wagner private military company emerged after Russia annexed Crimea and the Ukrainian Maidan Revolution of 2013-14. In Crimea and eastern Ukraine, Wagner backed separatists who sided with Russia. Russian law forbids mercenary groups, but Prigozhin and his mercenaries have played an increasingly crucial role in establishing President Putin's rule. The Kremlin denied any association with him until at least the spring of 2022. Wagner was also instrumental in Syria, where the ruthless commander Dmitry Utkin first emerged as a close ally of Prigozhin's. The mercenary organization has been present in several African nations, including Libya, Mali, and the Central African Republic, for quite some time. However, Prigozhin was not officially close to the president. If asked about a Russian private businessman who was involved in these activities, Vladimir Putin or his press secretary Dmitry Peskov would say only that they were aware of his existence. However, it was obvious that such operations could not be carried out without approval from the Kremlin. Wagner had been receiving massive state funding for years, but it wasn't until June that President Putin finally admitted it. But he claimed that there was no such thing as private military firms because doing so was against the law. Wagner's involvement in the fighting in Ukraine was not reported until the summer of 2022. Prigozhin quickly toured Russian prisons to enlist inmates in the war effort. A Kremlin spokesman described him as making a big contribution, and a man whose heart aches for what's happening. Prigozhin's criticism of the Russian military and the defense ministry intensified after he opened the Wagner Center in St. Petersburg in November. His criticism grew louder as Russian forces were repeatedly driven back in Ukraine. He was upset that the army leadership was ignoring the mercenaries' efforts during the war. Later, while thousands of men were being lost in the battle for Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, he publicly accused Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov of starving Wagner of ammunition. Prigozhin even directed his ire at the president, calling him "Grandad" in Russian. To paraphrase, how can we win a war when Dedushka is a moron? Although he did not directly accuse Putin by name, the Russians were left in no doubt as to who he was referring to. The Kremlin avoided commenting on the growing conflict, but it was a dispute that rocked the foundation of Russia's leadership and led to the downfall of Prigozhin. He turned down a request from the Defense Ministry to subjugate all mercenary organizations to its authority. As tensions rose, he dared to question the very reasons for the war. On the 23rd of June, he declared a «march for justice», heading toward Moscow. According to the BBC's sources, Prigozhin tried to draw President Putin's attention to his conflict with the Russian military by staging a mutiny. He was worried about losing his autonomy, said one person familiar with Prigozhin. Up to 15 Russian soldiers were killed when Wagner mercenaries shot down 2 military helicopters and an airplane. President Putin called Prigozhin a traitor who drove a knife in the back of the country, without mentioning him by name. This failed uprising was meant to be the final straw in their relationship. Vladimir Putin met with his former ally for 3 hours at the Kremlin, along with more than 30 Wagner commanders, days after the failed rebellion. Vladimir Putin no longer required his services, but it was unclear what had become of his men. Prigozhin's final online video appeared to be shot in an African field, and in it he boasted, "Here we are, putting God's fear into ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other bandits." But, like many other examples in Russian history, his story appears to have ended soon after. A man who was brutally punished and ultimately destroyed after being given the task of enforcing the Kremlin's cruelest policies. Put another way, Vladimir Putin said of him, "He was a man with a difficult fate and he made serious mistakes in life."